Hello and welcome to a revision video. In this video we'll be looking at the question, there was no significant or sustained opposition to Nazi racial policy 1939 to 45. Assess the validity of this view. As always, remember to highlight or underline key parts of the question to make sure you're fully understanding what you're being asked before answering. So things like looking at the dates of the question. So this is specifically looking at during World War II, 1939 to 45. And it's asking us, is there no significant or sustained opposition? And specifically it's asking about racial policy, not just in general opposition. So was there no significant or sustained opposition to racial policy during World War II? And I would be arguing for the purposes of this revision video that I would strongly disagree with this statement, and that actually there was clearly significant and sustained opposition, although mostly the most sustained and significant opposition happens from about 1942 onwards, possibly mirroring the fact that racial policy was becoming more extreme at this time as well. So some of the most sustained and significant opposition that we see comes from the Jewish people themselves against the Nazi racial policy, unsurprisingly. Most of this opposition, as we've already argued, happens from sort of 1942 onwards, the most significant opposition, and that takes forms such as Jewish partisans, so groups of Jews who had escaped from camps, concentration camps and things in occupied areas, that started to fight against the Germans to try and stop other Jews being forced into ghettos or to being forced from ghettos into concentration or death camps. It's estimated that there were probably approximately 20,000 Jewish partisans in occupied countries in total who were helping other Jewish people. And they were actually causing significant and sustained opposition. So, for example, we know that in Lithuania, hundreds of trains were derailed by Jewish partisans, and around about 3,000 Nazis were killed by them during the course of doing this. We also know that in Minsk, in sort of 1941 to 42, Jewish partisans formed a resistance group who helped around about 10,000 Jews to flee from Minsk ghetto into the forests, and quite a number of those Jews were killed during the process of fleeing. However, it is still significant opposition to the Nazis and quite sustained opposition as well. We know, although perhaps it's not quite as sustained, that in France there was a Jewish army, the AJ, formed that smuggled 500 Jews across the border to Spain to save them. So maybe not quite as large a number as those who were saved in Lithuania and in Minsk, but still a fairly significant operation as well. One of the really significant pieces of evidence that we have of significant and sustained opposition to Nazi racial policy is, of course, the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, April to May 1943. The uprising lasted for 3 months. That's clearly sustained opposition. And we know that the numbers of people involved were also fairly radical. So there were around about 70,000 Jews remaining in the ghetto when the uprising took place. And we know that approximately 7,000 Jews died fighting during this uprising. We know that there were actually 2 different groups of Jewish fighters who formed to try and support the uprising as well, the ZOB and the ZZW. And they also worked with the Polish resistance movement, obviously secretly, doing things like creating homemade grenades and pistols, and also creating underground tunnels and bunkers and things to help during the uprising. We know that the Nazis saw the Warsaw Ghetto uprising as a significant form of opposition, partly by looking at the way that they responded to them. So, for example, the fact that the SS deported 42,000 Jews to Dublin concentration camp immediately following this uprising, and over the course of 2 days had them all shot, suggests that the Warsaw Ghetto uprising was seen as a very significant and sustained threat to their Nazi racial policy, because otherwise they wouldn't take such extreme action. There's also evidence later on as well, in sort of 1944 to 45, of prisoners rebelling in death camps as well. So specifically in Auschwitz, there's a prisoner rebellion in October 1944. One young Jewish woman had been smuggling gunpowder from where she had been being forced to do munition work in Auschwitz-Birkenau, and the plan was for a group of Jewish people to try and blow up the gas chambers to prevent what was going on there. They weren't successful in doing that, but it was still significant and fairly sustained opposition, in that they took a long time planning what they were doing and getting all the resources that they needed. Around about 450 Jews died fighting in the rebellion at Auschwitz-Birkenau in October 1944. And okay, they didn't manage to actually blow up the gas chambers, but they did manage to blow up or at least partially burn down crematoria number 4. So that was a significant form of opposition to Nazi racial policy from the Jewish people. So clearly already we can see that there is significant and sustained opposition against Nazi racial policy, 1939 to 45, although, as we've mentioned, most significantly from 42 onwards. Our second best evidence that there was significant and sustained opposition against Nazi racial policy is the actions of ordinary Germans, or perhaps actually we should really say ordinary people who opposed Nazi racial policy. So, for example, we could use in February 1943, there was a protest known as the Rosenstrasse protest, and during this protest there were around about 1,800 non-Jewish wives who protested for over a week in Berlin, which is obviously fairly sustained opposition, to stop their Jewish husbands from being sent to camps in Poland. And it is significant opposition because the Nazis did actually give up and they allowed the husbands to be returned to their non-Jewish wives. So that would be an example of actually fairly successful as well as significant opposition to Nazi racial policy. Another example of fairly successful and significant opposition would be Edward Schultz. So he's actually just an individual, but what he did is fairly significant. So he happened to be a German industrial businessman. I think he was producing things like zinc, and he sort of uses his position to disguise what he's really doing. So he leaked the first reports to the Allies that the Nazis planned to murder the Jews in July 1942. So that information was obviously key to encouraging the Allies to take action to support Jewish refugees, to try and take further action to invade, to persuade America to become more involved in the war. So Edward Schultz, this German industrial businessman, leaking these reports to the Allies that the Nazis were planning to murder the Jews, is significant opposition to Nazi racial policy. Another example of ordinary people, although not specifically Germans, but people in an occupied area by Germany, ordinary people opposing Nazi racial policy would be in Amsterdam in February 1941. The Dutch population there launched a general strike in response to the arrests of Jews. Ordinary people were trying to prevent Jewish people from being deported to camps. and they were relatively successful. It is a sustained and significant form of opposition to the Nazis. They were able, as a population, to save around 30,000 Jews who were able to escape into other areas that weren't occupied, or to be hidden away by other members of the population. So about 30,000 Jews were able to be saved. Obviously, they weren't completely successful. Around about 107,000 Jewish people following this general strike were actually sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau. However, the fact that they were able to save around 30,000 Jews obviously is still significant and sustained opposition. And finally, we have to address the church. Within the church, there is also some significant, if not perhaps quite so sustained, opposition to Nazi racial policy during this period of World War II. Two of our best examples of this would probably actually be the White Rose group and a Lutheran priest who's part of the confessional church called Bonhoeffer. So if we start with the youth group, the White Rose group, I'm sure you're aware that the White Rose group were a group of university students, and they are an example of youth opposition in general, but also it's worth noting that this group were mainly made up of Christians of different denominations, and it's significant to see that despite the fact that they had these different denominations, they were united and not divided in their opposition of racial policy from the Nazis. They initially, they are significant in opposing the Nazis because they're doing things like publishing pamphlets to make other people aware of what they're doing. Their first 5 leaflets or pamphlets were only spread in Munich, so they weren't particularly widespread, although it's still a fairly brave thing for them to do. It was their 6th leaflet, which was spread across the whole of South Germany, giving information about the anti-Semitic policies that were in place and encouraging people to take action against them, as well as against other Nazi policies. That was the most significant form of action that they took. And it was this quite brave action spreading across the whole of South Germany that was the reason that the Gestapo was able to catch them. And the strength of response from the Nazis, the sort of the harshness of the punishment, executing the 3 main leaders of the White Rose group, shows how significant a threat the Nazis thought that they were. The other individual that's particularly worth mentioning in this World War II period is the priest Bonhoeffer, and he was involved in opposition against Nazi racial policy, which was fairly significant. We know that he wrote a memo, for example, in 1941, which shared details of the fact that the Jews were being deported, and encouraged this sort of program to stop. We also know that Bonhoeffer was involved in a program called Operation 7, and Operation 7 was a plan to give Jewish people papers to help them to escape Germany. And it was when this particular thing, Operation 7, was discovered by the Gestapo that led to his arrest and also a warrant for his execution, which shows how significant the Nazis thought that Bonhoeffer was as a threat. And the church is seen as a significant threat to racial policy because they're so influential. Millions of Germans were continuing to attend church services, and the Nazis were concerned that they might be won over to the ideas of their church leaders if they spoke out against Nazi racial policy. So to summarise, assessing the validity of the view that there's no significant or sustained opposition to Nazi racial policy. I would argue that clearly this is incorrect. There is significant and strong opposition, sustained opposition, and mostly this occurs from 1942 to 45.